Pitch bend. Oh, hey, I send that. I got a pitch bend control. Do I send control changes? Oh, yeah, I send these basic ones. Some devices, that'll explode into a massive area. Do I have any guitars here? You play guitar? Okay, great. Do you own any digital effects units? Couple things? Okay. I have this thing from Line 6, this Pocket Pod thing, and I thought I had a PDF for it, so let's see. Pod PDF. There it is. This is the manual for a guitar product, PDF for it. What I want you to notice is when we get into this area here for MIDI, this is its implementation chart. I know you can hardly see it, but it's insane. This is one page, another page, another page, another page, another page. You're like, why would a guitar product want with MIDI? Well, you can control everything inside of it. Similar to their amps, the Line 6 amps, you can go in and say, hey, I want to control what amp setting I'm on. Program change. Oh, hey, I want to change this delay parameter or whatever. It says literally, okay, send out number 95. Great. So I can go on here and say, okay, this sends 95, and now I'm remotely controlling it. You just make the numbers match. It's really not that advanced. I'm selling all the magic here, you know, getting myself out of a job of consulting. But basically, that's it. I mean, it's like, oh, hey, these are numbers and make them match. So, so basic messages. We got, of course, some other messages you can get into, like stuff for doing synchronization. I mentioned the panic button, right? Some devices will have a panic button. This one does not, so it shows an X under the transmitted column, but it does respond to it. An all notes off message, I know what that is, so it'll turn it off. Some other kind of basic messages. But anyway, that's the idea. It's like, okay, hey, I have this Roland and I have this Line 6. Can they talk? You know, this one's transmitting, this one's listening. And that's the idea of the chart. Not that you need to go run home and do this, but what's cool is you can. Okay. I just briefly want to talk about connections and just talk about, you know, kind of where things have been from there. MIDI for, you know, since the dawn of it, 1983 approximately, has used this type of connector, a 5-pin DIN connection. DIN is German, Deutsche Industrial Norm, and some kind of thing. What's a little strange about using 5 pins is they're only using 3 of them. I think, you know, this is one of those things, I don't know if you know about the lore of it, but I joke sometimes that maybe 5-pin connectors were on sale. You know, it's one of these things that I know a couple companies have tried to do other port stuff from it. I remember Atari doing a 3-port kind of, or a through port with it, and then I've seen dangerous stuff like sending power down the other pins, which can be really scary. Yeah, and the scary thing is that, you know, it's like, well, you know, got to put a little lightning bolt. Don't plug this into something else because you might damage it. So yeah, so it's one of these things that it never became part of the standard to use all 5 pins. The basic standard in version 1.0, which is also kind of fascinating. How many versions do you think MIDI's been through? It's still version 1. Which is amazing. You know, 25 years later, you know, talk about USB even, and they're working on USB 3 already, and there was version 1, 1.1, they've been upgrading it all the time. But the whole idea of MIDI was to gather all these people together and have universal communication. And so they are working on an upgrade. They talk about it all the time. They have a really terrible name. I hope they don't pick it. HD MIDI or MIDI HD. I'm like, oh. That name is just so worn out. Yeah, so they're still version 1, and they're talking about other stuff. There's a lot of stuff happening in the communities and the universities. There's this whole subset of thing called OSC, Open Sound Control. We'll see if that ever takes off. A few devices use it. It's interesting. Definitely from a programmer standpoint. And I know you're really into Linux and stuff. You might check it out. But that's a very interesting combination of audio and MIDI. It's not quite as relegated the way that MIDI is to just these basic messages. MIDI cable also has a couple other limitations. It's one way. It sends MIDI data one direction down the cable, and so that leads to some weird connections, which I was going to kind of maybe briefly show you a little bit about. I don't know if these keyboards are hooked up. I didn't know how far I was going to get into that, but maybe we can show it or not. But it's also very slow. It sends information at 31.25 kilobits per second. Anybody know what a kilobit is? Do you remember dial-up? Anyone? Dial-up was what? 56K? This is 31K. All right, so yeah, we've been through a lot of them, right? And so yeah, it's just, you know, the speeds are just way, way, way back. So, but when we're sending basic messages, 31,000 bits every second to a human being, that's a hell of a lot of bits, especially when one message is only 24 of them. I mean, that basically we could send upwards of 1,000 messages a second. I don't see how that's a problem. Well, they kept coming up with more uses for MIDI. Lighting, automation, control surfaces, all this sort of stuff. Striking a key, that's one message, letting go of another key. But what about if I move this knob? How many messages could that be? Even with the 128 resolution we talked about earlier, that could be 128 messages going up and 128 going down. Do you see how that might start, if we're going crazy, clog up a cable? And that's where it has its problem. For basic usage, music creation, it's great, and it does just fine. There isn't really a big latency or delay or any kind of problem that has. The problem was when people started figuring out lots of advanced uses. And so what's happened, very interestingly, is one of the big problems is most computers don't have this 5-pin jack. I'm one of the few people who owned an Atari ST, and one of the reasons I bought it is because it had 5-pin MIDI jacks on it. But I mean, how many people have heard of Atari anymore, right? Except for the video game system. Did you own an Atari ST? Oh, really? Oh, that's awesome. Oh, great. We use like a early version of Cubase. Okay. Okay. Yeah, no, that was great. I mean, Fatboy Slim, I don't know if he still uses it, but I know when he was doing a couple soundtracks recently, the one for Moulin Rouge, he was doing music for Moulin Rouge, and his Atari still in the background. People are like, what is that thing? It's like, it's my sequencer. It's like, well, you know, it's 20 years old. Yeah, it works. It's a tool. I mean, all it needs to do is note on, note off, and all this different stuff. And they said, why don't you get a new computer? Because I'll be playing video games. USB version 1.1, two things. It sends and receives, which is great. And so what usually had to happen with a computer is you'd have a USB jack, and you had to buy what's called an interface. And that interface would plug in the USB port and give you the two 5-pin connections and send and receive through that jack. It's still MIDI. It's still a note on. It's still a note off. It's still velocity. In fact, that's the connection I'm using on my laptop, is a USB connection. And it avoids us having to buy an accessory interface. I mean, you guys still sell them, and in some situation it makes sense to, you know, if you got a really elaborate MIDI rig, to have like they call it a multi-port interface. One USB, and you got like 4 MIDI ins, 4 MIDI outs, or I have one that has 8 ins and 8 outs. And so in a big studio, you might have even multiples. The guy, I think of as Hans Zimmer, famous composer and stuff like that. He's got 11 of these interfaces I own. He's got 88 ports of MIDI. It's like ridiculous, So this guy is doing music for Gladiator and the Dark Knight and stuff like that. So he's got the money, but it's amazing, and that's connected. Each one's just connected to one USB port. So you can go that, or actually, yeah, all of them are like 8 of them are to one port. So one USB port can actually send enough information for like 64 ports of MIDI, which is pretty amazing because it's at a speed of 12 million bits per second. So it's dramatically faster, and almost 1,000 times faster. So like 500 times faster in that range, right? Version 2 of USB, which is pretty old now, it's been around for quite a while, is actually 480 million bits. They doubled it 40 times. I think the new version is going to be into gigabits, billions of bits, so we'll see. But USB's really taken over in that sort of idea of, I want a controller, I want to connect to my computer, but is it still MIDI? Yeah, it's still those basic messages, but they can send it without this speed limit. MIDI had 2 limitations. One, it's one way, which I'm getting used to here. Talk about protocols. The Metropolitan Phoenix had like, I think 2 one-way streets, and so I'm getting used to that in downtown Honolulu, right? But also there's a school zone, right? It's like all information goes down one lane at this speed in one direction. And so USB is still serial. It still sends 1 bit at a time, but it sends it at such a high speed, and it can send and receive. And so what some devices might do also is give you the same ports with it. You can use either one if you want, but basically the same. Like you've seen MIDI messages going to my computer and then also going out the MIDI port to my analyzer. So, but yeah. And the other nice thing is that USB can power devices. MIDI sends a little bit of voltage. It's like 5 volts. It's not very much as far as powering lots of other devices. But in a lot of situations, I could unplug this power adapter, and my laptop can power this device, which is really nice for portability and stuff. So USB definitely has some advantages. Anybody know where USB came from? Who developed it? You'd think Apple, because it's on like all the iMacs and all that stuff and so forth. But it's Intel. Intel kind of came up with the idea of it, and so you see it. They work with so many different chip manufacturers, so it's definitely permeating out there. So, other questions?